And greetings YouTube gamers, welcome to another episode of Retro Raider. My name is Johnny Retro and welcome to the channel. Okay, so cheap and retro are two words that usually don't match very well together when we're talking about retro gaming collecting. You know, 2017 and the prices are crazier than ever. It's very easy to step back if you're new into the hobby. Long are the days where you could go to a flea market with just a couple of bucks and come back home with a bag full of good old video games. It is just a very saturated market, everybody knows about it, and a lot of people are misinformed about the correct prices. But there's still hope, you can still find good deals nowadays, and what I'm going to bring you guys today are 5 systems that are still cheap to collect this day. So stick around and look at my suggestions right after this. Now let's start with the handheld, and these are technically going to be 3 systems in one. And it's the Game Boy. We're talking about classic Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. You can get any model of Game Boy for just a couple of bucks. With a couple of exceptions, of course, limited editions and stuff like that. But it's a very cheap system to collect this very day. Especially if you buy in big bundles, and there's a variety of games on this beautiful platform. I would suggest the Game Boy Advance SP if you want to play on the original hardware. I think it's the best option even for classic Game Boy titles. Or for Game Boy Advance gameplay, you can actually use the Nintendo DS to play them, and those are also very cheap. There's of course, the Pokemon games and a couple of more rare and obscure RPGs, but in general it's actually very cheap to collect for the Game Boy. Okay, for number 2, another handheld, and this is probably the black sheep of the handhelds, and it is the Game Gear. A lot of people focus on the Game Boy, a lot of people focus on the Atari Lynx, others focus on the Neo Geo Pocket Color, and yet bulk collectors go after stuff like, the Quick Shot Supervision and Wonder Swan, but Game Gear is dirt cheap. Especially for the type of collectors who are going for full sets, Game Gear is probably one of the easiest ones. I can think about 2 or 3 titles that can reach, 100 bucks or so, but in general, it's very cheap to collect. I go to flea markets all the time, and I spot Game Gear games for 2 euros, 3 euros, anytime. But there's a catch if you don't know that much about the Game Gear. The chances of getting a good, proper working unit are a little bit low. And usually if you spot a good working unit, it can be a little bit expensive, so to speak, for a handheld. But the thing is that if you grab a broken unit, it's actually very cheap to get and very cheap to get it fixed. Game Gear is an awesome 8-bit handheld, cheap to collect for. Now let's jump into the home consoles and talk about Atari 2600. It still amazes me that a lot of collectors just don't care about the 2600. And it's a system that it's not very easy to get into for 2 reasons. Rather you played it back in the day and you're going after it for nostalgic reasons, or you're just like me and I fell in love for the Atari 2600 because, everything that we have today as a home console is thanks to this. This is the granddaddy. And I'm still very fresh on the Atari department. I've been collecting for the 2600 for about 2 years or so. And let me tell you this, I don't think that I've paid more than 5 euros for Atari 2600 cartridge. Now unfortunately Atari is not very popular here in Portugal, but when I spot 2600 games, they're cheap. So of course that, I have to rely on online platforms like eBay and stuff like that, but from what I see, people just don't care about these. So they're just cheap to collect for. They're beautiful. Now number 4, and this one is a little bit on the edge because it's starting to rise up in price, but I think this time is the perfect time to jump into it. PlayStation 1. We are starting to see a rising price in retro CD based systems. Systems like the Sega Saturn is getting a little bit crazy, Dreamcasts more or less, but like I said, the PS1 is still a little bit on the edge. And of course there are exceptions like in any other system, but CD-based systems are actually a very important piece on retro video game history. Especially the first ones of course, and PS1 is probably the cheapest one to get. And since it was one of the best-selling consoles of all time, they're everywhere. There are PS1 games everywhere. And I'm also a suspect here because PS1 is actually my favorite video game console of all time, but PS1 actually has a very solid and diverse library. So for new retro gaming collectors out there, I strongly recommend Sony PlayStation. Okay, for the last system, and we haven't talked about retro PC gaming yet. There are a lot of options to go through, but today we're talking about cheap systems to collect for, so I want to talk about ZX Spectrum. The good old Specky. Now, it's very possible that if you live in America, you probably never heard about the ZX Spectrum. But here in Europe, this thing was huge. So it's a very basic 8-bit microcomputer, and if you compare it to the Commodore 64 and stuff like that, this is not as advanced as those. But it definitely has its own charm, and that's why I love collecting for it. So the type of model that you will pick, it will influence the price a little bit, but it is not that bad. You can easily get a ZX Spectrum between 30 to 60 euros all the time. But the games are dirt cheap. They're cheap. They're just dirt cheap. And of course that you have to do a little bit of research, because ZX Spectrum, it's one of those systems where there's just a lot of piracy going there. You can easily get a bundle of 100 games and only 10 of them will be original. But it's also part of the charm of the ZX Spectrum, I would say, but you know, a big chunk of my collection is actually ZX Spectrum. And if you're new in this, you are probably going to buy them in bundles, and usually the bigger the bundle, the cheaper is the game individually. And believe me, I think that I have never paid more than 20 cents for a ZX Spectrum game. You have a massive library of games to pick from. So ZX Spectrum, very cheap to collect for. And there you go, guys, these were my 5 cheap retro gaming video game systems to collect in 2017. But I would like to hear your thoughts on the subject, so feel free to leave your comments on the comment section below. Also, don't forget to put a like on this video, please subscribe to the channel, and take care of yourselves, take care of the gaming community, and game a lot.